Hey, how y'all doing? So, today we're going to be talking about Viola Davis's movie, The Woman King. So, for those of you who like to follow what I do, I did a conversation with Society Reviews on his channel about The Woman King. It was on YouTube, so I'll probably link it in the description if I remember. So, if I don't remember and you actually want to hear me talk about it with other people, you could go there. But if you just want to hear me talk about it, well, we're going to talk about it right here, right now. Now, the movie in and of itself, the too long, didn't listen version, is that the movie wasn't particularly very good. And the story, I think, failed on multiple different levels to actually tell a tale that was interesting, engaging, and something that people want to sit with for over 2 hours. The movie was 200 minutes, which is about 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was a long film. Now, the plot of the movie is that the Dahomey and the Oyo are sort of at war. They're long-term enemies. Each country has been engaged in slavery. The Oyo love slavery. They're in league with the Europeans. So they supposedly have modern weapons and more modern weapons. And they have no interest in stopping the slave trade. While the Dahomey are having internal strife about the slave trade, as the character Naniska, which is played by Viola Davis, doesn't like slavery. And she's trying to talk the king, King Gezo, who is into dropping slavery as a source of income in the Dahomey Empire. Not one time do you see them actually trade slaves, but there is some acknowledgement that the Dahomey were slave traders. So a lot of the people who say they didn't acknowledge it, they did. It was very much in passing, and it was very much in the way of anytime it was mentioned, they mentioned how it was a moral failure, and it was something that should be frowned upon, which leads to one of my first critiques of the movie, is that it introduces a lot of ideas that would not exist at the time. To tell a nation that their most lucrative trade should be stopped on moral grounds rather than we have found some other means of fixing the economy is a disaster. We're currently going through this right now in the United States, where we're talking about climate change. So you have all these people who are now saying, hey, we have to change the economy. And other people are saying, you're going to destroy the quality of life that we have. You want to get rid of fuel for cars? How are we going to transport goods across country? You want to limit our food? That's going to starve people. What are you doing? That is a legitimate conversation to have. They had one conversation in this movie about it, and it was all about, hey, we have other options. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. But they never really engaged in those other options. They never really pushed how that could work, or rather, they never really quantified that slavery was the most lucrative of all the things that they could do. So, sure, they could have sold fur, they could have sold anything, they could have, but was it going to be more lucrative than slavery? The answer is probably no. So that's kind of the same situation we're in currently in our own political system, where, hey, we might want to, quote, save the planet, but we don't want to destroy our civilization in order to do it. So how about you guys go out there and find some alternate ways of using energy? Oh, we've got wind, we've got nuclear, we've got solar, we've got all these different things. Of course, all these things have their own drawbacks to them. And there's a limitation to it. Solar energy, what happens when the sun goes down? Nuclear energy is kind of persona non grata. People are having a problem with that. But that's the kind of conversations that we should probably be having in these movies if we're going to introduce this idea of fundamentally changing the Dahomey economy. We should definitely be having a conversation about that. And they had one conversation throughout the entire movie about changing and flipping the entire Dahomey economy, and they wanted to do it on moral grounds. This takes to my second point, which is the concept of slavery being immoral really was not quite there yet. One of the many things that we see in this movie is that Viola Davis's character is a victim of slavery. In the movie, they show scenes where she was abducted, she was raped, she gave birth to a child, she put a shark's tooth or whatever in the child's shoulder and gave the baby away. Then she came back to her people. She escaped or was saved. I don't remember how that really worked out. And as I said when I was doing the review with Society Reviews, that would have been a good reason for Viola Davis's character to say slavery is abhorrent. I actually went through it. It's awful. We should not do that to people. But they didn't go that route. They went with the tried and true slavery is immoral argument, which, of course, in 2022, we all agree that slavery is immoral. But in 1853, I don't think they would have made that argument, especially when their entire economy is relying upon it. I don't think they would have made that argument. There was also a lot of Pan-Africanism in this piece. There were parts where Viola Davis's character is, again, talking about slavery, and they're talking about, hey, we only sell our enemies. We capture people, they sell them. And it becomes from there, they're still Africans, I'm trying to, let's see if I can find the exact words. So she's talking to the king, actually. And from my notes, it says that she says, quote, even if they are not Dahomey, they are still our people. The white man has brought inhumanity. Won't stop until the whole of Africa is enslaved. This is, again, when the entire continent engages in slavery. You can't make that moral argument that the Europeans, even brought inhumanity. If you consider slavery to be inhumane, which we all do, you also participate in it. So you're a hypocrite for talking about it. And she actually does participate in slavery. So does the king. And the Pan-African concept of, we have to care about our brothers and sisters and other tribes and other clans. Well, Africa is very tribal, very, very tribal. They would not be thinking that much about the tribes of other people. They would not be thinking that much about other tribes. That's why when people engaged in slavery, they sold their enemies because they didn't care about those tribes. That's why they killed them. That's why they killed the men and took the women. So the idea that would even exist is not even functionally correct. It just makes no sense. So that's just a couple of the ideas that once you bring them into the movie, they really don't make that much sense. Another critique I have is actually a critique of the Dahomey in general, even in real life, and that is the desire to, bring in young girls who were, I think, like 14 years old or whatever. Now, in the movie, of course, they're an elite fighting unit. They're the best of the best. And Viola Davis is 60 years old, and she's beating up men a quarter of her age and killing them in fights, and she's taking heavy punches from them. And, we already know how ridiculous that kind of stuff can get in these movies. But the concept of teenage girls being warriors is absolutely abhorrent. It is abhorrent. And I think that's something that's actually kind of missed too. Now, in a lot of the run-up to the movie and some of the responses, Viola Davis talked about, kind of as if it was a sad thing, that these young girls were essentially drafted from their homes and drug into this system where they were forced at 14 to 16. They were forced to take an oath where they can never marry and all of this kind of stuff, which is all tragic stuff. And some of the stuff is actually in the movie. There's a young female character in the movie who is told she can never have a man. She can never, she has to forsake love and she's sort of the young, rebellious type where she thinks she can do everything. And, she's actually very talented, but her mind is that she's a young girl, so she's kind of screwed up. And all of that makes sense, but you have to consider in some of the extra readings I did on the Dahomey, and it's history, so you never really know how much of it is true and how much of it is, certain historians wanting to highlight certain things while other historians wanted to hide other things. But generally speaking, you wouldn't bring your teenage girls into the military. It wouldn't make sense because, for starters, their upper body strength isn't the same as a man's. Second, why would you put your able-bodied women who could be producing children, put them in harm's way? That literally doesn't make any sense. That could lead to the death of your entire society. Because if you have a bunch of women out there who are being killed. Now, I did see one article that I read on the Dahomey said that there were warrior women, but a lot of them were women who were either barren, or these were women who were a little bit older. They had already had their children. They weren't going to have any more. And this was just kind of their way of being useful. But they had female soldiers for about 50 to 60 years or something to that effect. So we don't know at what point that may have lied, because I didn't write it down and I don't remember it. So maybe that's how it started. Maybe that's how it turned into. Like, we know they started out as bodyguards, because there was a king who was paranoid, and he surrounded himself with women because, he figured he could trust women. He couldn't really trust the men. And they went from bodyguards to a small police force, and, which is, I think, one of the greater pieces of information that I found was how they were basically a police force. They were his wives and the women who could possibly be his wives. This is what, Black Panther and the Dora Milaje is based on. This version of the Aganje, they called them. And they were basically his bodyguards, and they dealt with local problems within the kingdom. They would go to a certain town or a village, and they would settle things by either whipping people or, fighting. But they became an army, of course, later on. An elite or an army unit. I don't know if they were an elite unit, but they were an army unit. So that's just something out there that I think should be noted, is that as we are watching this movie, I am seeing young women not only engage in hand-to-hand combat with, people much bigger than they are, and with far more upper body strength than they have, but the fact that you would put able-bodied women who could possibly be bringing more children into your kingdom, you're putting them in harm's way to get shot and carved up. It literally doesn't make any sense, Kind of confusing that you would even do that. As per the usual when it comes to this kind of movie, the enemy, is of course a totally misogynistic. The Oyo have no respect for the Aganje, despite the fact that the Aganje beat them every single time they fight in this movie. There is at no point you see that the Oyo are dangerous or that they're badasses or anything. They're basically just misogynists who never really learn. They invade the Oyo, kill a bunch of people, and save the Dahomey that they kidnapped. Then later, they engage in another fight where the Aganje won that fight too, even though a couple of Aganje were captured at that point in time. But at no point throughout this movie is these misogynistic Oyo, are they in any way positioned as being a threat. They're just basically generic misogynistic males who love slavery and are looking forward to raping all of the women that they enslave. That's pretty much it. They're one-note characters, the Oyo. They really don't serve that much purpose outside of, if our heroes are anti-slavery, then the villains have to be pro-slavery. If our heroes are female, then our villains have to be male. And that's essentially all they did. They didn't really add anything in terms of color or character to any of the to the Oyo. And to be quite honest, there was not much color or character to most of the characters in the Dahomey side either. For instance, the king is highly ineffectual. He's mostly quiet. He's either being lectured to, or he's asking somebody their opinion, and they're educating him. He doesn't really do anything. At no point does he really like later hammer down and say that he's the king. He's actually being defied over and over. He was defied by his wife. He was defied by Naneska, who's Viola Davis's character. He's completely and totally emasculated. But it's a light emasculation. It's not completely and totally he gets shouted down all the time. But it's more or less, I can make these decisions. We'll talk to the king about it later. And even when in these conversations with the king, he comes across as being very indecisive and very much relying on other people to provide him with information, and he doesn't really have a mind of his own. To that point, as far as having a mind of his own, and that character and character traits, Viola Davis's character is entirely humorless. She smiles near the end of the movie. She has absolutely no fun whatsoever. She's incredibly masculinized as a character. She is essentially the uptight drill sergeant of this movie. She even, yells at the young lady who we find out later is her daughter, who she finds out later is her daughter. It's not enough to be the best. After the young girl, kind of snaps off at her and says, I can do whatever I want. Essentially, I'm the best. You see what I can do. And then Viola Davis's character tells her it's not enough to be the best. And then the young lady says, I know about you. You were captured. I'm never going to be like you. They're never going to capture me. And then remember, I just told you that, there was a battle with some Oyo, and there was a couple of Dahomey that was kidnapped, or captured rather. Well, she was one of them. So I like that part, at least, that her young hubris was actually punished. So she had, her ass on her shoulders, and then it became time where she actually did get captured. So I did like that, but the character of Viola Davis is completely and totally masculinized. She's a murder machine with no human emotion whatsoever. You see all of the ritual of, the Dahomey, the training. You see all this through the eyes of the young girl who is coming into the kingdom, and she idolizes the sort of Amazons, the Agonje or whatever. And she's just the young girl. She's just an opportunity for us to see like their training methods and all this kind of stuff. But that stuff went on far too long as far as the training methods and everything. That stuff just went on forever. But Viola Davis's character being the main character, and she's so incredibly boring. She's just such a mean character, and she's of course the moral center of the universe in this movie, where she's the one person on the Dahomey side that is anti-slavery, and it's up to her to convince the king to be anti-slavery. It's very, very bizarre. So let's go through the 4 David Mamet questions, which will allow me to tell you about this movie, and then I'll get into my final grade of the film. So the 4 David Mamet questions are: 1, what does your hero want? 2, who or what stands in their way? 3, what happens if they don't get it? And 4, why now? So for the woman king, 1, what does your hero want? So our hero is Naneska, who is played by Viola Davis, and what she wants is to defeat the Oyo, who is their longtime enemy, and to prevent the spread of slavery throughout, I'm guessing, Africa, because her character mentions it more than once that, as I said earlier, even if they are not Dahomey, they are still our people. She's looking at it from all of the Africans are our people, so she wants to stop slavery. A good goal, to have for your character. The why is kind of missing, because you're not sure why she wants to end slavery. Again, we know that she was, in her backstory, she was enslaved, but they don't use that as a reason for her to be against slavery. So she has a good reason. Her motivations are good, but we just don't have a why for her motivations. 2, who or what stands in their way? So there's a couple of things that stand in her way to prevent slavery in the Dahomey kingdom. One is the Oyo, which is their actual enemy. The Oyo are, actually killing them, kidnapping and selling their people. And the Oyo are getting rich doing slavery. They're getting rich, and this is a good source of income for her own people. So the king is standing in the way, or the queen also is standing in the way. And this is also where the white slavers come in. So the white slavers come in, a little bit later in the movie. They're not a big part of the film. They're providing weapons, and there's that temptation there with the white slavers. They're basically a source of temptation. Keep selling us slaves who will keep providing you with weapons so that you can fight the Oyo, who, if you don't kill them, they'll kill you and enslave all of your people. So how do you stop that circle? This is actually a pretty good conflict. I don't mind it, except for the Oyo, again, as I said, are not a formidable threat to the Dahomey, and at least not in the form of the movie. You don't really see them struggle at all against the Oyo. 3, what happens if they don't get it? Clearly, slavery spreads. The system remains the same. Naneska is a revolutionary character in this movie. She's trying to change tradition. She's trying to change what is currently going on in the world and in her society. So if she fails, her society remains the same. It doesn't change. So generally speaking, that's it. And if they, if she doesn't get it, she has this belief that all of Africa will be enslaved by the Europeans, which is just a belief of that character and not necessarily something that the Europeans intend to do or state that they intend to enslave all of Africa. But she truly believes that. Now, of course, that is also an anachronistic idea, because somebody in Western Africa wouldn't know that the Europeans are involved all over Africa doing this sort of thing. She probably wouldn't know that, but whatever. So generally speaking, the third question can be answered by saying her character is a revolutionary who wants to change how her society functions. She wants to change their economy. She wants to change how they look at other people. That's a really good, what happens if they don't get it? You have to change hearts and minds on the subject of slavery. So that's a good, what happens if they don't get it, is that things remain the same. We continue with this horrid, abhorrent act of slavery. Okay, good. Now 4, why now? Why does she care about this now? And this is where I mentioned earlier about Naneska's motivation. We never see why she cares so much about slavery and thinks it's going to be, inhumane or the bane of their society. We never get an answer to that. We never get an answer to the why now. Why now? Now, the why now, why the movie is occurring, and they tell you this at the beginning crawl. They do like this Star Wars crawl at the beginning, telling you that the Oyo have now merged with the Mahi, and they are both working with the whites to get advanced weapons, and the Oyo are now invading Dahomey territory, kidnapping and enslaving their people. Fine. That's why this particular battle is taking place. While they are currently engaged in war with the Oyo, that's why, that's happening. But that doesn't tell us why she now wants what she wants. What about right now makes this battle, why not come to this, idea about slavery being inhumane and abhorrent 10 years prior or 10 years afterwards? There has to be a reason right now, and we don't get that answer. So when you look at the David Mamet question, I gave 3 of the 4 of them. I said they were actually pretty well done. But the problem is that the movie is incredibly long. It's boring. I don't care about any of the characters. And even if you say, look, who cares about the historical inaccuracies? It's Hollywood. I actually agree with you with that. I think people harp on the historical inaccuracies a little too much. I think that there's enough problems with the movie itself that just talking about some of the historical inaccuracies is like, okay, you're just kind of piling on. It's like, did you even see the movie? Because we understand that they're trying to turn slavers into the good guys. But understand, there were ways to do that. You could have done something where the Dahomey were engaging in slavery. Then there's a change. Something happens in their society, in the king, in Nanesca, Viola Davis's character, whatever. And now they're going to be against it, and it could be a redemption story where people who were for slavery are now against it for this reason. It could have been because there was, Viola Davis's character was kidnapped and sold into slavery. And since it was mostly fictionalized, why not the king himself had been kidnapped and sold into slavery, and then he was saved. And then he says, you know what? No more slavery. We're not doing that anymore. I went through that. That was horrible. We're going to change our entire society. I don't care if it cranks our economy. We're going to change. We're not going to participate in slavery anymore. There was none of that. There was no reason for us to see that they were going to change. Okay? Because for starters, we didn't see them really engage in the bad behavior in the first place. We were just kind of told that they did engage in that behavior. Now, since story is my thing, I don't really care about the acting. I don't really care about the cameras and the direction and all that kind of stuff. For me, it was a poor film. It was just entirely too long. It wasn't interesting. I didn't care about any of the characters. A lot of the Hollywood wokeness stuff was in there with the misogynistic males and the emasculated males and the moral centers of the universe being the women. And there are no men apparently in the Dahomey Empire that fight because there were no battles featuring men. In real life, the women were a supplemental military to the men. They fought alongside them most of the time, but they weren't the best of the best. They're his most elite warriors. But this is a movie about them. This is a movie about the women. So, okay, fine. You want to focus on them. Okay. Now, in terms of real world and what the people who wrote the movie, the actors who acted in the movie, Viola Davis has gone on record as saying, "Oh yeah, trying to guilt trip people into seeing the movie, or you'll never see a women's action movie like this again, or black women, sorry, action movie like this again." She said she made this for a younger version of herself who was made fun of for being too dark and all this kind of stuff. And I just looked at that and said, like, it's all ridiculous. And they cloak their failures in activism so much that it's actually kind of embarrassing, but one thing that really kind of concerned me was that they screened the movie in Benin for the family of King Gezo. His bloodline still exists. And, they talked in this article that I read about it, that, about them being in tears, that they were inspired at this story, and they have built statues. The statues already exist of the female Amazons or Agonje and from their society. And I said to myself, I just couldn't get over it. I'm thinking, in our United States, we constantly have to have these arguments about, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln and all these guys who owned slaves and whether they should have statues. And we in America want to tear those things down, but we're A-OK creating a movie that instills pride in slave traders and in the children of slave traders. If this movie was made for white people, by white people, it would have been, you're a bad person because you engaged in slavery. You should feel bad. Even if it was 200 years ago, you should feel bad today that you were engaged in slavery 150 years ago. Somehow, when it comes to the people of Benin, you were engaged in slavery 150 years ago, but you get a big budget Hollywood film that essentially whitewashes that, pretends that you were the most heroic, freedom-thinking, progressive society ever, and you get to build and keep statues for your slave traders. How insane is that? All right. Thank you guys for your time. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.